I'm going to show you 3 things that you can make with brioche dough. First, I'm going to show you how to make some sugary donut holes that are delicious. I'll show you how to make some cheesy pesto swirl sandwich bread. And then I'll show you how to make the best and most delicious cinnamon rolls I have ever made in my life. These are so soft and delicious. And all of these were made with the same base dough. It's a sourdough brioche dough that I showed you how to make in a different video. I'll link to that recipe in the description, but if you have any kind of brioche dough in your fridge, that'll work for all of these recipes. I made a double batch of dough and then I split it into 3 parts, so you really can just mess around and wing it when you have some extra dough in the fridge. I want to show you that you can just kind of use what you've got and make some awesome things. For these donut holes, I flattened the dough into a rectangle. Then I cut that rectangle into strips with my bench knife. And then I cut those strips into little pieces of dough that I thought were the perfect size for donut holes, or about the perfect size. As you'll see later, these ended up being a little bit big, so you could cut them into smaller pieces than this if you want to. You could also measure them out and weigh them on a scale if you want to do that, but I was just kind of winging things here. Then I just stretch and folded each little piece of dough and kind of rolled it into a ball, just like I would do with a larger loaf of bread. And I was dipping one side in flour a little bit to keep it from sticking, but keeping the other side sticky so that I could roll it against the counter. You want to have one sticky side at least so it doesn't slide all over the counter. So I ended up with 18 donut holes. I put them on a silicone-lined baking sheet, covered them up, and let them proof until they were doubled in size. It took about just a few hours. And then, since these are donuts, I wasn't even going to try to do a healthy version, and I just decided to deep fry them. Actually, I'm not sure if this is deep frying or just regular frying, but it was a good amount of vegetable oil in this pan. And I heat the oil to 365 degrees Fahrenheit. I try to get it right at that point. And then I wanted a really super simple topping for these donuts, so I just filled a large bowl with some regular white sugar. I decided I was just going to toss the donuts in the sugar when they came out of the fryer. Once my oil got to 365 degrees Fahrenheit, I started dropping little balls of dough into the hot oil. And since I don't fry very often, I was kind of just going by feel, honestly, on how long to cook these donuts. I cooked them definitely for a few minutes on each side, and I flipped them once they started looking pretty brown on the first side, which was admittedly a lot harder than I thought it would be flipping a round donut hole. They definitely wanted to keep flipping on their own, but that is besides the point. I cooked them for a few minutes on each side, and when I thought they looked done, I took them out and transferred them into the bowl of sugar that I had prepared earlier. I tossed them in the sugar for a few seconds to get all the sides coated completely with sugar, and then I transferred them to a plate and let them cool down. Then I just repeated the same process with the remaining pieces of dough until they were all done. And I ended up with these, some sugary, delicious looking donut holes that I made with just some leftover brioche dough. Most of the donut holes ended up like this one, where they were perfectly golden brown on the outside and super soft and fluffy on the inside. But then some of them ended up a little bit doughy on the inside. So definitely make sure your oil's at the right temperature and you're cooking these all the way through. All right, the next thing I'm going to be making with brioche dough is going to be savory, and it's going to use up something I already have in my kitchen cupboard. It's going to be a cheesy pesto sandwich bread. Basically, the idea is I'm going to flatten out this brioche dough and then spread some pesto and cheese on the inside and roll it up and proof it and bake it like a sandwich bread. So if you're following along with me, go ahead and flatten out a slab of brioche dough and get a flour side against the counter and then a sticky side on top. Then you're going to get some pesto. It can be homemade pesto or store-bought pesto like this, and just spread it out, a good layer of pesto on top of the dough. You could really use any savory filling you have in the cupboard, but I'm going with the traditional basil pesto for this one. After the layer of pesto, I'm going to go ahead and just layer in some sliced low-moisture mozzarella cheese. This would really be a better case for shredded mozzarella cheese, but I didn't have any in the fridge. I just had these slices, so I figured I would use them up and hope for the best. Once you've got your cheese layered in, it is time to roll up the dough. So just start at the end that's farther away from you and carefully start rolling. And as you can see from the cheese sliding around there, this would definitely be a better time for shredded cheese, but you got to use what you have sometimes. So roll up your dough and close the seam on the other end and kind of just flatten out the sides of the bread. And as always, you'll just want to make sure that you've made your loaf just a little bit smaller than your loaf pan so it fits snugly in there. Then, as you usually do when you're working with yeast or sourdough, you're going to proof this until it's about doubled in size, then it'll be ready to bake. Just a few hours later, this had doubled in size, filled the pan, it passed the poke test, and so I was ready to bake this. I moved it to my preheated oven. I had preheated it to 400 degrees Fahrenheit with a pie pan in the bottom rack. And once I put the bread in there, I just poured some hot water in there for steam. And I let this bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 40 minutes. And out it came looking like this. By the way, I almost always mention this, but my nonstick pan is amazing. If you want a nonstick pan like this, check out the link in the description. Anyway, this bread got pretty brown on top. It's not going to win any beauty contests. I could have baked it at a lower temperature with an egg wash on top to make it look a little bit better, so you can do that if you want to follow that kind of process. I let it cool for about an hour and was ready to cut in, and this is what it looked like on the inside. Okay, as you can see, there is some unattractive separation where the pesto meets the top of the bread. That often happens when there's a lot of moisture in the filling. Probably wouldn't get top marks on the Great British Bake Off, but hey, Paul Hollywood never gives them enough time to bake bread anyway, so I'm kind of bitter about it. Also, they only have one bread week and like 3 pastry weeks. It's really annoying. Anyway, this bread tasted so good. This is definitely a bread you want to have warm, and if not warm, at least toasted. The cheese and pesto go so well together. If you like pesto on your pasta, you will love this brioche pesto swirl sandwich bread. All right, the last thing I'm going to be making with this brioche dough is some cinnamon rolls. And like I said earlier in the video, these turned out to be the best and most delicious cinnamon rolls I've probably ever made in my life. Brioche really is the perfect dough for cinnamon rolls. All the cinnamon rolls I've made in the past have been with an enriched dough, some milk, some eggs, some butter, but never as much milk, eggs, and butter as in this brioche recipe. So that really gives these cinnamon rolls a soft and fluffy texture, which is what most people want in a cinnamon roll. So I flattened the dough into a rectangle and started rolling it out with the rolling pin. It really doesn't matter how big your dough is or how much you have. You can always just make more filling to fit however much dough you have. And the measurements really don't matter either. Just make a rectangle that's a little bit longer than it is wide. Then one of the easiest fillings you can make for cinnamon rolls is just a simple cinnamon sugar mix. I'm doing 5 teaspoons sugar, white sugar, to 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. Then I'm just going to mix all of that together until it's thoroughly combined. And there you have cinnamon sugar. This will be just about enough for my size of cinnamon rolls. To get the cinnamon sugar to stick to the dough, I'm just taking some melted butter and spreading it all over the dough. Some people like to mix the butter with the cinnamon sugar mix and make like a paste to put on the dough. I think this method that I'm using right here is a lot easier and it tastes really good too. So just sprinkle all the cinnamon sugar mix over the top of the melted butter. Use as much as looks right to you, don't overload it with cinnamon sugar. You don't have to use all of the mix that you made, and you can always make more if you need more. Then I like to roll the cinnamon rolls up using the long side. So just kind of crip it down a little bit once or twice, and then start rolling towards you. Once the cinnamon rolls are rolled up into a log, just kind of crimp that seam closed a little bit with your fingers, and make sure your tube of dough is nice and straight. Then there are a bunch of tricks for cutting cinnamon rolls, but I just like to use my serrated knife. Give the cinnamon roll a few pulls backwards towards you, and then cut all the way through cleanly. Now for these, I am not measuring or weighing how big the cinnamon rolls are. I'm just slicing it into 7 pieces because that's what looked good to me. Now I'm transferring those pieces into a cake pan that I have lined with parchment paper that I crinkled up. I like to crinkle up a piece of parchment paper so it kind of fits better into the cake pan. Then I'm just arranging the cinnamon rolls spread out a little bit apart. They're not quite touching right now because when they proof and puff up, they're definitely going to be touching and they're going to be all up in each other's business. But I like cinnamon rolls that way where they're all proofed together. So then when you pull them apart, it's nice and soft on the sides. As with all these recipes, cover it up and proof until roughly doubled in size, and then you'll know it's ready to bake. Just about 2 hours after that point, my rolls looked like this. They're definitely puffed up, doubled in size, and I was ready to move these to the oven. About 30 minutes before, I had preheated my oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and I went ahead and baked these for 25 minutes. While they're baking, the best time to make a glaze or icing is now. So I'm doing a simple powdered sugar icing, and I think it's probably the easiest icing you can do for cinnamon rolls, and it turns out really, really good. The ingredients are simple: powdered sugar, confectioner's sugar, and milk. You could technically use any liquid you want, but I like to use milk. Basically, just take a couple tablespoons of milk and keep adding powdered sugar into it, and eventually you're gonna get a nice consistency that's thin and pourable, but it's still thick enough that it's an actual icing. Whenever I make this, I always forget how much powdered sugar you need to actually thicken up the milk. Basically, compared to the milk, you need a lot of powdered sugar. But if your icing gets a little bit too thick, you want it a little thinner, add some more milk. And then in the same way, if it's too thin, you could add more powdered sugar, stir it, and see if you like the consistency. The cool thing about this is you don't have to worry about salt levels or acid or anything like that. You've just got a liquid and a solid that you're mixing together to make a consistency that you want for an icing. I'll put the ingredient amounts that I used in the description to the video, but pretty much just adjust the ingredients as necessary until you've got an icing that you are happy with. I was happy when my icing looked like this, so that was good enough for me. After 25 minutes of baking, I took the cinnamon rolls out of the oven, and with the parchment paper, I just lifted them right out of the metal pie pan and set them down to rest for a few minutes. They don't need that much time to rest because you want to put the icing on the cinnamon rolls while they're still warm. So go ahead and pour your icing on top of your cinnamon rolls. The warmth is going to kind of melt the icing, and it's going to create this awesome hardened layer of icing on top of the cinnamon rolls as they cool down. I want to make these again right now as I'm watching this video back because these were so good. So pour all the icing on, and then you can like spread it around with a spatula if you want to, or you could just leave it on as you poured it. I prefer the spatula just because I wanted to get icing in every kind of nook and cranny on top of these cinnamon rolls. Once you're happy with the icing, do let these cool down because you're going to see the icing harden and look kind of like this. I think the best time to eat these is when the icing is hardened, but the cinnamon rolls are still warm. I just ripped into this, pulling one straight out from the other cinnamon rolls. It's got those soft sides when they proofed up together. And the brioche dough just made these so soft and fluffy. They were just so incredibly soft, especially when they're still a little bit warm. You could just like feel it when you're pulling it apart, how soft these were. And they also just melted in your mouth. They were so good. So if you do have some leftover brioche dough in the fridge, or you just want to make something different with brioche, try some of these ideas. Try donut holes, pesto bread, cinnamon rolls. Brioche really can do it all. So if you need a brioche recipe, I definitely recommend trying out my sourdough brioche recipe. You can click on that video right here.